Hello, everybody. I'm excited to catch up with Robert Gutmann, who is today an academic, but he was the chief economist of the WTO. If any of you still remember, between 2014 and 2022. So it's very current, very up to date. So the moment I met him, I had to pull him aside and do this chat, especially with Trump's tariff wars and everything that's happening. Robert, being a trade man, okay, how does this tariff war shows up, in the supply chains? Where is it showing up? In the trade of for value. We hear the top line numbers and we hear what's being done, but we haven't had enough conversation on how it's actually affecting the real economy.
Right. Well, Emmanuel, if I may, by the way, I'd suggest there's an American euphemism, remember the Alamo. And I would say, remember the WTO, okay? Don't forget it. It's still there. It's still very important. But back to your question. So I think trade is remarkably adaptable and adjustable, right? So, and trade tends to flow where there's the least frictions. And when you think about something like the WTO and negotiating lower tariffs, that's reducing frictions. But there are other kinds of frictions in trade. There's, geographic distance. There's other policies other than trade that can affect trade flows. So when you get someone like Donald Trump raising tariffs, it's increasing some of those frictions, but it may reduce the direct trade between the United States and China, but it tends to not necessarily reduce overall trade as much as Donald Trump might want. So you get trade flowing, instead of directly between the US and China, it goes through Vietnam, or it comes in through Mexico, or Chinese exports go to some other country and stay there or move on. And you can see this in things like the great financial crisis, COVID-19, the Russia-Ukraine war, that it can have a negative effect on trade in the short term, but after you recover from that shock, you see trade recovering very significantly, although it might be reorganized. It may, in fact, I like to talk about what we see happening right now is sort of the reorganization of globalization. Right? So we still have globalization. It's just that trade flows are moving around in different ways, essentially following the path of least resistance.
The thing about trade, and what I put my finger on, is this trade in value add. Why? Because that's how you try and figure out where's the most benefit, being generated in which jurisdiction, in which activity. And then when I think about just the slapping of tariffs, it's almost like, slamming on the value add to try and destroy it because you can't tell anymore. In the past, you have the value add smile, where the value is being generated and all that. What's happening to that?
So value added trade is pretty resilient. It is right now slowing. So we've seen the growth of trade compared to GDP slow down, but we also see the value-added component slowing down. And there's, upstream value-added and downstream value-added. But one of the big things that we start to see happening now is value-added trade sort of separating within regions, right? Or within geopolitical blocks. So value-added trade has always had a very regional component to it. There's the Asian region, the European region, and the North American region. And there's a lot of value-added trade that flows in those regions. But with globalization, there was also connected spillovers between the regions. Now we're starting to see trade potentially break into geopolitical regions where there might be sort of a China-centric region and a US-Europe-centric region. Value-added trade is still occurring quite a bit within those regions, but now there's a bit less between the regions. So in the end, it does reduce value-added, okay? If we see negative economic consequences or GDP consequences from trade. Although often what it means is that the pie is growing slower than the pie is actually shrinking. And now with this geopolitical separation, it's how is the pie being split up? So if you think of value-added trade as the pie, and is it growing faster or slower? But really what we're seeing is that the way the pie is growing a bit slower, and it's being divvied up differently.
And then there's the impact of new technologies on the value add. So if you take AI, for example, it's obliterating entire supply chains. Is that showing up in your research? Are you doing any new work to?
Well, it's pretty new, and we are trying to follow that. We are trying to look at sort of the impact of digitization on trade, and AI is one element of that. I would say there's lots of ways AI will help facilitate trade. I know big logistics firms want to use AI to try to optimize and reduce the cost of their logistics components. But I think AI's bigger impact is more sort of on the domestic value added and how it's being generated and who's contributing to it. So so value added is essentially payments to capital and labor. AI sits more on the capital side, right? So I think it's going to have probably bigger distributional effects on the distribution between payments to capital and labor. And it will also spill across value added across the globe, as those countries that aren't able to take advantage of AI may be seeing a reduction in their role as AI increases the productivity of labor and capital in other advanced market economies. So the digital capabilities and the ability to incorporate AI and use it efficiently and effectively is going to have important effects. We just don't know exactly how they're going to play out yet.
Yeah, I want to test this idea with you, Prof. Okay, when you look at the numbers, trade worldwide, $500 billion?
Yeah, about 30% of GDP,
right.
Global GDP.
Global GDP. Capital flows are a magnitude of that. That's probably where the real story is. So the theory that I have is that the U.S. contribution to the global economy is not even trade.
Yes. Yeah. So you've hit on a very big and important point here, because those capital flows do affect trade, right? The U.S. has been a very innovative and relatively productive economy over the last, say, 10 to 15 years, even recovering from some of the shocks that I talked about earlier. The rest of the world views investment, portfolio investment, and foreign direct investment in the U.S. as a good use of their money. And it's all relative, right? So it's a relatively good use of their money, and that's those capital inflows then require those outside investors to acquire dollars to be able to invest in the United States. And one of the ways they get those dollars is through trade, and trade with the United States. They can get dollar in terms of trade with other countries too, but the biggest market for dollar trade is in the United States. And if they want to make those investments, they've got to earn those dollars, and that there's a complex savings and investment relationship here, but that really drives a lot of the trade balances and the trade flows.
In fact, I'd even say that the U.S. is even on services, and you may need to correct me on this, which is even on services, the U.S. is in a decline. In that services probably fragmented now, it's regionalized. It's not something that you can export globally, and every economy needs to have a service component in its economy. Because I still remember the days when the U.S. was exporting financial services, and today when it tries to do that, under the Trump administration, the country's just pushing back because.
Well, and there are barriers to, and have been barriers to, financial services trade. A big complaint of the U.S. in terms of like the access to the Chinese market. And China's reforming. But, so there are services that are non-tradable, and there are services that are tradable. And often in goods exports, there's a lot of embedded tradable services and non-tradable services. So services and there's an old...
It's there somewhere.
It's there somewhere. So, and increasingly with digitization, we're seeing services trade growing much faster than goods trade. So I think it's really important to realize that increasingly, because of digitization and opening up in some markets, plus the indirect contribution of services to manufactured goods trade, services actually is very, very important. Now, things like haircuts, right, or going to the dentist or something like that, that's not very tradable. But who knows, in a few years, you may go into a barbershop and you put some robot thing over your head, and a barber in India may be cutting your hair, right, remotely.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
The thing is that actually, I'm pushing you to the frontiers of what's going on. What is your take on the legacy of large economies, that the world belongs to the large economies? Now with productivity increasing dramatically, it doesn't pay to be a China or an India or a Bangladesh or a Vietnam. This thing of GDP being generated through population, how do you think that's changing, or what's your thoughts on that?
Well, so the basics of economic growth are population growth, labor growth, right, which is associated with population growth, and accumulation of capital. And then there's the magic elixir of what we call total factor productivity, or innovation and productivity growth. And a big challenge for a country like China is the demographic future that it faces of declining population. But, Japan's been there. And while it may affect the overall size of the GDP that you generate, you really want to look at per capita GDP, right? So I'm not sure that the size of your economy, either absolute size in the global economy, or how can I say this? What really matters is how your individual citizens are experiencing economic growth. And it may not reflect with overall GDP growth. So if you have a declining population, but per capita income is still growing fast, even if it's not fast enough to keep up with the population decline contribution to overall GDP, you can still have a very wealthy, very happy economy. Okay.
Right. Okay. Only because I have you, and you're my brain's trust for how the World Trade Organization thinks about everything: inflation, labor, right? How does labor, or how did labor factor into the negotiations, and also migratory labor? How did that factor in the WTO negotiations?
Well, it didn't. All right. So when the idea of the WTO came into being, it was a Havana Charter in the 1930s, and it had labor elements in it. But with the creation of the GATT and the WTO, the labor elements were not in there. And the focus of something like the WTO is really to sort of separate out labor, environment, all these other kinds of issues from the negotiation of global commercial policies. And I think over time, countries have started to come to understand that the original concept of the ITO and that Havana Charter kind of made sense, because those things are connected, and it's really hard to disconnect them. So increasingly, members do want to talk about these issues, but they're complex issues, because the interests of advanced market economies are quite different in the labor provisions is quite different than developing countries.
Yeah, but you see, labor, what it does also is that it collapses prices in the advanced economies, and it actually moves wealth to the production economies, which in the past was not possible.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I agree with that, because despite frustration in the United States about economic growth and the concerns about outsourcing and offshoring production and manufacturing, we've actually had pretty full employment. There's been challenges with the distribution of the wealth that's been created, but that's really a domestic policy challenge that's not really a trade policy issue, because there are other countries that have faced exactly the same globalization forces as the United States, but their domestic policies have been much more sensitive to how the increased wealth growth of GDP is distributed. So Trump's idea of putting tariffs in place to try to bring jobs, good paying jobs, back to the United States, I don't think is really going to work. I suspect what we're going to see is more automation in the factories that get produced in the United States. And there'll be some good jobs that are produced, but many of those jobs will be electrical engineers managing the robotics and the automation, not somebody turning a wrench or, banging a hammer. So it's other kinds of policies that help with how that growth is distributed.
It's funny because just listening to you, I get this impression that I'm talking to a big country person as opposed to a medium or a small country person, because the small country economies can take a much more structured approach to labor, and even direct it to what it needs to be, not what needs to happen. But in a large country, labor wasn't a factor in production in that way, right?
So I think the rise of Trump has much to do with these labor market outcomes,
because it's obvious, it's something that you can look at.
That's right. Now, technology, most economists, trade economists, would argue technology's been by far the bigger driver of this growing inequality. You could also throw in tax policy and some other fiscal policies, right? But at one point in the United States, when I graduated from high school, way back, a lot of the students in my class were studying to be bookkeepers, and they could leave high school and go to work for small, medium-sized, large enterprises and be bookkeepers. But then there was the development of software.
Right.
And the job for bookkeepers went away, right? I can give you lots of examples where either automation or software has dramatically changed the demand for certain kinds of skills. And if you didn't learn and adapt, and actually I'll tell you a little story. I was a Soviet specialist. I wrote my dissertation on the Soviet Union.
Control and command economy.
Yeah, I was very interested in how different economies work. Still am. That's why I do what I do.
Right.
But I stopped being a Soviet specialist and broadened my skill set to focus on broader issues around economic development and international trade. I had to learn and adapt a whole new set of skills, despite the fact that I invested 5 years of my life in becoming the Soviet specialist.
Your PhD?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
This is amazing. Okay, now let's just go back to WTO and multilateralism.
Yep.
Where is multilateralism now? And where is the WTO in multilateralism? Because I think, there's so many different configurations now. China is at least 4 different or 5 different multilateral arrangements and creating its own ecosystems and so on. So what's to become of the WTO? What role does it play in a world where the superpowers, whoever they are, create their own ecosystems?
So over 80% of global trade takes place under WTO MFN tariffs.
Okay.
There's every free trade agreement that's been signed builds on the fundamental underpinnings and rules and commitments of the WTO. Often it extends them or it goes beyond them. And but the DNA of most free trade agreements has a lot of WTO in it, right? So if the WTO were to go away, it would undermine many of those free trade agreements. I don't think that the WTO is going to go away. I do think the WTO needs to change and adapt to the very significant change in geoeconomics. So it used to be a small number of countries, particularly when you think about things like the Uruguay round or earlier GATT negotiations. It was usually about the US negotiating with Europe, maybe Japan, and then everybody else was like, okay, well, the deal that they're cutting works for us, right? But with the rise of the other Asian economies and the rise of China in particular, and the fast growth in India, suddenly the fundamental nature of how the WTO worked, with a small number of countries reaching agreement on something that worked for them and worked for everybody else, well, these other countries that have experienced very fast economic growth now feel they've got something they want to say. And that complicates the negotiations. And what I think has to happen is the WTO has to become more flexible and adaptable to the fact that the world has changed very significantly. It may not do the same things that it used to do, but it's still, that foundation of those commitments and agreements are very, very important. If that goes away, global uncertainty rises. But then how do you build, it's sort of like a big renovation, right? The old house needs to be renovated. We're going to take it down to the studs and we're going to rebuild it. But that foundation and those studs are still very important.
And the nail that holds it together is enforceability.
Yes, some people say that. Okay, so some people talk about how important is the dispute resolution mechanism of the WTO is the crown jewel.
Yeah.
I actually argued, and have argued for years, that the crown jewel of the WTO has two elements to it: transparency and reductions in uncertainty. So those two things, I think, are far more fundamental, because even with the dispute resolution mechanism at the WTO, because of sovereignty, no country actually had to abide by any ruling.
Okay.
Right?
It's mutually,
Now, with the updated one in the WTO, it did allow for retaliation for the foregone benefits of the agreement, but often, the EU had a dispute with the U.S. and the EU have had numerous disputes around things like BSE, hormones in beef, chicken, and things like that. Right. So the EU basically said, no, okay, you go ahead and retaliate. We have this domestic regulatory environment. We have a different philosophy when it comes to food safety. We're not going to change our policies as a result of that.
But if the original terms were based on WTO rules, can an EU, for example, change the rules unilaterally, and then, it does, like on palm oil, they affect a number of countries.
Well, almost every country. In global geopolitics, there's sort of the realist view of the world, which would argue things like the WTO shouldn't exist, because it's all about realpolitik and strength and power and twisting people's arms. Whereas the whole idea of the WTO is sort of a liberal view of coordination, cooperation, integration, right? Not just power-based politics. Now, despite that liberal idea, the real politics has always been there, okay? It's just that it's been constrained. There have been guardrails on those real politics. What now we see, and by the way, they've also implemented that the EU and the US had sort of competitive approaches to free trade agreements. And much of that was around whose regulatory philosophy are we going to get countries to buy into. Despite all that, there's still this extraordinary value to sort of real liberalism, where you recognize that there's significant benefits from integration, cooperation, and coordination, but it's also taking place in a world of realistic geopolitical and geoeconomic circumstances where countries are pursuing their own self-interest. And the idea is to try to channel those forces into something more productive than just arm twisting.
Robert, I'm so happy that I caught you. I haven't met the WTO man for a while, and to bring me up to speed again to where everything is, and also the economics of tariffs and how that will work out in terms of global trade and where the value add is to be found. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I hope I can catch you another time after I've digested everything that you had to say. Just amazing spending time with you today.
Thank you.